The sun rose gently over the horizon, casting a warm golden glow across the peaceful countryside. The air was still, barely a whisper of movement in the trees. Bird song filled the air, soft and sweet, weaving a melody that seemed to hum in harmony with the earth itself. The scent of fresh dew lingered in the grass, mingling with the faint aroma of wildflowers. As she woke, Clara felt the cool touch of the morning air on her skin, a stark contrast to the warmth of the blanket that wrapped her like a cocoon. She opened her eyes slowly, blinking away the remnants of sleep. Her room was bathed in soft sunlight, the edges of the curtains fluttering gently in the breeze. For a moment, everything felt perfect, but as she breathed in the morning air, there was something off. A slight unease crept into her chest. The room, though calm, felt too quiet, as if something was waiting to be heard. She turned her head towards the window, trying to shake off the odd sensation. The world outside was still, no movement, no animals, no sign of life. A shiver ran down her spine, though she couldn't say why. The silence stretched on, the sound of her own breath feeling too loud now in the stillness. Clara rose from the bed, her bare feet touching the cool wooden floor. She walked over to the window, her fingers brushing the soft fabric of the curtains. As she pulled them back, the morning light poured into the room in a flood. But her eyes froze as she looked outside. The meadow, usually full of life, was eerily still. The tall grass waved gently in the breeze, but there were no birds in the trees, no animals in sight. Nothing. She could almost hear her heart beating faster now, each thump louder than the last. She stepped back from the window, a knot of dread forming in her stomach. The house felt suffocating suddenly, the air too thick. Was it just her imagination? The silence was oppressive, as if the world itself was holding its breath. A distant noise broke through the stillness, a soft scraping sound from outside. It sent a jolt of panic through her, though she couldn't identify its source. It was as if something was dragging across the ground, slow and deliberate. Clara's pulse quickened. She stepped away from the window, her heart racing. She glanced around the room, trying to calm her mind, but the discomfort only grew. The scraping noise continued, each sound making her feel smaller, more vulnerable. She moved towards the door, but then stopped. Something wasn't right. The silence had returned, but it felt heavier now, suffused with an unfamiliar tension. Clara hesitated, then slowly turned back to the window. What had caused that noise? Her breath caught in her throat as she saw it. A shadow, moving just beyond the treeline. At first, she thought it was an animal, but the shape was too large, too wrong. It stood still for a moment, like it was waiting for her to notice. And then it moved. Closer. The hair on the back of Clara's neck stood on end. Her legs felt weak beneath her, but she couldn't tear her eyes away. The figure was now almost at the edge of the trees, its features obscured by the shadows. Clara's heart raced, every instinct telling her to run, but her body refused to move. The figure paused, as though it was waiting for her to react. The scraping sound started again, louder now. Closer. Her breath quickened, a sense of urgency rising in her chest. What was it? What was out there? She could feel her pulse thundering in her ears, her skin prickling with a mix of fear and confusion. Then, as quickly as it started, the sound stopped. The figure in the trees was gone. The world outside was still once more. But Clara couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. Something that wasn't supposed to be there. The unease settled deeper into her chest, and she couldn't escape it. What had she just seen? What was out there, hidden in the shadows? The quiet of the morning, once so soothing, now felt like a trap. And as Clara stood frozen in place, she realized that the world outside was no longer the peaceful place she had woken to. It had changed, and so had she. Clara stepped back from the window, her breath shallow, her mind racing. Her hands shook slightly as she gripped the windowsill for support. The peaceful summer morning she had awoken to now felt like a distant memory, replaced by an unease that crawled under her skin. She tried to reason with herself. It was nothing, just a trick of the light, maybe, or perhaps an animal. But deep down, she knew that wasn't true. The figure in the trees, the unnatural stillness, it felt wrong. Her heart thudded painfully in her chest, each beat heavy with uncertainty. The house around her felt colder now, though the air outside was warm and inviting. She glanced towards the door, but her feet felt like they were rooted to the floor. The longer she stood there, the more her imagination began to run wild. What if that figure had been real? What if it was still out there, lurking just beyond the trees, watching her every move? She could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on her, pushing her further into a corner of her mind where fear festered. Clara turned her back on the window, pacing the room in an attempt to calm her nerves. But the movement didn't help. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the wind outside, made her jump. The house, once a sanctuary, now felt like a prison. She moved towards the stairs, hoping to break the tension, to find some comfort in routine. But as her foot touched the first step, she froze. A sound, soft, almost imperceptible, reached her ears. It was faint, a whisper in the stillness, but it was unmistakable. Scrape, scrape, scrape. The sound was back. Clara's stomach dropped. She could feel her pulse in her throat, her limbs heavy and unresponsive. It's coming closer. The scraping continued, deliberate, unyielding, as though whatever was out there knew she could hear it. It wasn't just the trees. It was coming from somewhere closer now, from the very walls of the house itself. Clara's eyes darted around the room, searching for the source. But there was nothing. The scraping grew louder, more pronounced, and Clara's breath quickened, her mind racing to make sense of it. Is someone or something in the house? No, that couldn't be. Her gaze snapped to the door leading outside. The shadow, the figure, had been beyond the trees. But now the scraping was unmistakably inside. She could feel the vibrations through the floorboards, a low, almost rhythmic sound that seemed to be moving closer, following her. Clara's body was frozen in terror. Her heart hammered in her chest, her palms slick with sweat. She couldn't bring herself to move, couldn't bring herself to make a sound, even as the scraping grew louder, closer. And then, just when it felt like her nerves couldn't take any more, the sound stopped. Absolute silence. For a long moment, Clara stood motionless, straining to hear anything at all. But there was nothing. Just the quiet. Her breath slowed, though she could still feel the racing pulse beneath her skin. Had it stopped? Was it gone? She dared to step forward, towards the door, then the hallway. Her bare feet made no sound as she walked, her eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. The air felt thick, charged, as if something unseen was lingering just beyond her reach. She reached the stairwell and paused. The world outside was silent, and yet she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. It was then, as she reached the bottom of the stairs, that she heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible whisper, so soft, so close, that she felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. Clara. The voice was low, a whisper carried by the wind. Her name. It was unmistakable. A cold chill swept through her, as if the very air around her had shifted. Clara's breath caught in her throat, her entire body frozen in place. The voice came again, closer this time. Clara, come outside. The voice was not her own, and yet it felt as though it was pulling at her, beckoning her with an unseen force. She stared into the dim hallway, her mind racing, her body screaming for her to turn back, to run, but her legs refused to obey. The silence pressed in on her from all sides, and then, as if on cue, the scraping sound returned, closer than before. Her feet moved, almost without her permission, towards the door. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if she were wading through thick fog. And with each scrape, her heartbeat grew louder, faster. Her hand reached for the doorknob, and as she touched it, she felt the cold metal beneath her fingers. Her fingers wrapped around the cold doorknob, but her heart was pounding so loudly in her chest that she almost couldn't hear the faint scraping sound anymore. It was as if her body had taken over, urging her forward despite every instinct screaming for her to turn back. The door felt impossibly heavy as she pulled it open, a creak of protest echoing through the house, breaking the silence with a jarring sharpness. Clara stepped outside, the warmth of the summer morning now feeling strangely distant, as though the air had changed, become thick and heavy with something else. The meadow stretched before her, the soft golden light casting long shadows across the grass, but it was empty. Still, too still. Her eyes darted across the landscape, scanning for any sign of movement, any trace of the figure, but there was nothing. Just the quiet. Then, the scraping sound came again, louder, closer, this time from directly behind her. Clara's breath caught in her throat as she spun around, her heart racing. Nothing. No figure, no movement. Only the endless expanse of the field stretching out before her. Scrape, scrape. It came again. But this time, it was unmistakably from below. She looked down, her breath catching in her chest. The ground beneath her feet was shifting. Slowly, Almost imperceptibly, it was moving, as though something was pushing its way to the surface from beneath. Clara stepped back, her legs unsteady, her mind racing. Her pulse pounded in her ears, the noise deafening. The earth below her feet was undulating now, small tremors rippling through the ground. She wanted to run, but her body felt paralyzed, her gaze fixed on the shifting earth. And then, with a suddenness that stole her breath, the ground gave way. A large crack split the soil wide open. Clara stumbled back, her eyes wide in horror as a figure began to emerge from the earth, slow and deliberate as if it had been waiting for her. The figure rose, taller than any human should be, its body contorting as it pulled itself from the earth. A chill ran through Clara, the air around her suddenly cold and suffocating, and her mind screamed at her to move. But she couldn't. She was rooted to the spot, unable to tear her eyes away. The figure's face was obscured by shadows, its form twisting unnaturally as it reached towards her, its long, bony fingers extending with a grotesque slowness. Clara. The whisper came again, a breathless rasp that made the hairs on her neck stand on end. Clara, come closer. The voice was now unmistakable. It was hers, but twisted, distorted. The figure took another step forward, and the ground beneath Clara's feet seemed to tremble. The weight of its presence was crushing. Every instinct in her body screamed to run, to escape, but her legs refused to move. She was trapped. The figure's long fingers were now just inches from her, the air around her turning unbearably cold. Clara's throat tightened, a scream caught in her chest, but no sound came. Her vision blurred as the figure loomed closer, its face still shrouded in darkness. And then, just as it reached for her, the world around her seemed to shift, to distort. The air grew thick and suffocating, pressing in from all sides. The figure's hand stretched forward, and Clara closed her eyes, unable to bear the horror any longer. But instead of the cold touch of its fingers, she felt a gentle warmth. A soft breeze lifted the strands of her hair, and the oppressive weight around her seemed to dissipate. She opened her eyes, blinking against the bright sunlight that now bathed the field in a soft glow. The figure was gone. The ground was still. The air was light again, carrying the sweet scent of wildflowers as if nothing had ever happened. Clara stood in the middle of the field, her heart still racing, her body trembling from the intensity of what she had just experienced. Had it all been a dream? A figment of her imagination? She glanced around, unsure of what to believe. But as she looked down at the ground where the figure had risen, she saw something. A single, dark mark, a deep, twisting scar in the earth. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make her blood run cold. The memory of the figure, its whisper, and the cold fingers reaching for her lingered in the back of her mind. She backed away slowly, her eyes never leaving the scar in the earth. And for the first time, Clara understood. The quiet, the stillness, the soothing summer morning, it had been an illusion. Something was out there, and it was waiting. Clara's legs felt weak beneath her as she stepped back, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The warmth of the summer sun, once so comforting, now seemed distant, almost foreign. She couldn't shake the feeling that the air around her had changed, heavier, more oppressive. The scar in the earth, the one that seemed to pulse with an almost unnatural energy, remained as a silent reminder of what had just occurred. Clara's eyes flicked from the mark to the meadow beyond, but the field seemed just as still as before, untouched by what had just happened. Yet, the silence felt different now, darker, as though the world was holding its breath. She could still hear the whisper of her name in the back of her mind, faint but unmistakable. Clara. It was there again. A breathless echo in the distance, a promise of something she couldn't understand. A chill crept up her spine, and despite the warmth of the morning sun, a cold sweat beaded on her forehead. Come closer. The voice was sharper now, urgent, like a pull on her very soul. Her body tensed, and she took a hesitant step backward, her gaze never leaving the scar. The ground felt as though it was trembling beneath her, subtle at first, but then unmistakable. A vibration that seemed to ripple through the earth, reaching her with an undeniable force. The sky above darkened, as if in response to the growing tension. Her heart skipped a beat. Then, suddenly, the ground cracked open again, this time with a deafening sound. The earth split wide, and from the depths of the darkness beneath her, the figure emerged once more. It was taller this time, its form more defined, its eyes glowing with an eerie light. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't move, couldn't even blink, as the figure rose from the earth like some ancient creature awakening from a long slumber. The air around her turned cold, so cold that it burned her skin. The figure's presence was overwhelming, its very being distorting the space around it. The whispers intensified, now not just in her ears, but in her very mind, echoing with a message that made her blood run cold. You cannot escape. Clara's pulse hammered in her chest, her body shaking with fear, yet her legs refused to move. Come to me, Clara. The voice was louder now, pulling at her from all directions, reverberating deep within her. The figure's eyes locked onto hers, its gaze like a weight pressing down on her. It was as if it knew her every thought, her every fear. Clara wanted to scream, wanted to run, but her feet were glued to the spot. The earth beneath her seemed to shift again, as if the ground itself was opening up to swallow her whole. The figure reached out toward her, its long, skeletal fingers stretching, closing the distance between them. For a moment, Clara was certain that her heart would stop, that the darkness would consume her. Then, just as the figure's fingers brushed against her skin, a bright flash of light erupted from the ground. It was blinding, so intense that Clara had to squeeze her eyes shut. The air pulsed with a deafening hum, like a great force was gathering power, preparing to unleash something far beyond her understanding. When the light faded, Clara opened her eyes, her vision blurry and her body trembling with exhaustion. The figure was gone. The scar in the earth had vanished, leaving nothing but untouched soil. The quiet returned, but it was no longer the same. It felt fragile, as if the peace had been shattered and could never be fully restored. Clara stood there, her mind spinning, unsure of what she had just experienced. Had it been real? Or had it been a dream, a nightmare she had somehow wandered into? She couldn't tell anymore. But as she looked around, a strange sensation crawled up her spine. She wasn't alone. The feeling of being watched was so overwhelming, so suffocating, that Clara felt her stomach twist with dread. Her eyes darted to the trees, to the edges of the field, but saw nothing. And yet, she knew deep down that something was out there. Something still waited, just beyond the shadows. The voice was gone, but its presence lingered. Clara. She could almost hear it again, just out of reach. A soft, lingering whisper that seemed to carry on the wind, brushing against her skin. And as Clara turned to walk back to the house, she knew that this summer morning, once so peaceful, had forever changed. The quiet was no longer a comfort. It was a warning. Clara walked back toward the house, each step heavy with the weight of what she had just witnessed. The air felt thicker now, as if the world itself was holding something back. Her feet moved almost mechanically, her mind still spinning with disbelief. The house loomed before her, its windows dark and empty, as though it too was waiting, watching. She didn't look back. The unsettling feeling that something was lurking just out of sight made her quicken her pace, her heart hammering in her chest. The closer she got to the door, the more oppressive the silence became. It was as if the world around her had fallen into a strange, unnatural stillness. Even the birds were quiet now. Clara reached for the doorknob, her hand trembling as she touched the cold metal. The chill ran up her arm, and she flinched, pulling her hand back for a moment. Her breath hitched in her throat, and she forced herself to grasp the knob again. She stepped inside, the familiar warmth of the house a strange contrast to the cold dread settling in her bones. But as soon as she closed the door behind her, the house seemed to shift. It was subtle at first, just a change in the air, a slight shift in the way the light fell through the windows. But Clara could feel it deep within her, like the walls were closing in. The house felt wrong. Her footsteps echoed eerily through the hall as she moved deeper inside. Each creak of the floorboards seemed unnaturally loud, breaking the silence with a disturbing clarity. Clara's eyes darted around, searching for something, anything that could explain the way she was feeling. But the house was empty, still as it always had been. She paused in the hallway, the shadows stretching across the floor, and as she looked down, she saw something that made her blood run cold. A faint, dark mark on the floor, right at her feet. It was the same shape as the scar in the earth. Her breath caught in her throat as she dropped to her knees, her hand hovering over the mark. It was fresh, too fresh. Her fingers brushed it, and the coldness from earlier seeped into her skin. She pulled her hand away quickly, her pulse racing in her ears. No, it can't be. The whispering voice returned, low and distant, but unmistakable. Clara. Her heart skipped a beat, and her body went rigid. The voice wasn't just in her mind this time, it was in the house. In the very walls. It was as though it was echoing from every corner, a presence that had filled the space around her. Clara, you've come back." The voice was calm, yet filled with an unsettling sense of finality. She could feel it now, the pull. That same force that had lured her out into the field, that same weight pressing on her chest. Her head spun, and she could barely breathe as she stood up, her legs unsteady beneath her. Something was here. Something that had followed her. The walls felt like they were closing in, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer, darker, creeping toward her with a life of their own. She tried to move, but her legs refused to obey. It was as if the house itself was holding her in place. The temperature dropped, the warmth of the summer day evaporating in an instant, replaced by an unbearable chill. Her eyes moved toward the staircase, and for a moment, she swore she saw a figure standing at the top. But when she blinked, it was gone. The house was empty, silent. And yet, the voice, those whispers, were louder now, pressing into her thoughts, as though the house itself was alive, speaking to her, calling her to it. "Come upstairs." Clara could no longer fight the pull. Her feet moved toward the stairs, not out of choice, but out of some unseen force that had taken control. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, their tone dark and urgent. "Clara, it's time." Her breath caught in her throat as she reached the first step. A cold breeze brushed past her, sending a shiver through her bones, and for a fleeting moment, she could hear something, a faint sound, like a rustling, just beyond her hearing. The second step creaked under her weight, the sound echoing through the house, breaking the stillness like a sharp crack. Clara's eyes flicked to the top of the stairs, her gaze narrowing in the growing darkness. She felt it then, the presence. It wasn't just the house. It was inside her now. The walls seemed to breathe with a heavy, rhythmic pulse, and Clara's own heartbeat was in sync with it, growing faster, louder. She reached the top of the stairs, her breath ragged in her chest, and her eyes scanned the hallway ahead. At the end of the hall, the door to the attic was slightly ajar. The whispering voice came again. "It's waiting for you." Clara's feet carried her toward the door, her body trembling, her skin cold with fear. And as she reached out to open the door, she realized with chilling clarity that there was no escape from what she had awoken. The house wasn't just haunted by a memory, it was alive. And it had been waiting for her all along. Clara's hand hovered over the doorknob of the attic, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts. Her mind screamed at her to turn back, to run, to flee the house and never look back, but her body, betraying her, continued to move forward, as though it was being guided by some invisible force. The whispers had grown louder now, a cacophony of voices, each one calling her name, pleading, beckoning. Clara. She barely noticed as her fingers closed around the cold metal of the knob, her grip tightening with fear. The air around her felt thick, almost suffocating, the weight of it pressing against her chest. The attic door was ajar just enough for her to see the darkness beyond, an impenetrable blackness that seemed to draw her in, swallowing any light that dared to approach. "Clara." The whisper came again, louder this time, as if it was right behind her, breathing down her neck. Clara's heart pounded in her chest as she turned the knob. The door creaked open, and she was hit with the overwhelming scent of dust and old wood, the smell of forgotten things. But there was something else, a rancid, damp odor that seemed to cling to the air, something she couldn't quite place, but it made her stomach churn. She stepped into the attic, her legs barely holding her up, her eyes adjusting to the dim light from the small window above. The attic was exactly how she remembered it, cramped, cluttered with old furniture, forgotten boxes stacked high, and the remnants of a life that once lived here. But now there was something else in the air, a heaviness that hung over the room, thick with malevolent energy. Clara's gaze flickered across the space, her eyes catching on the shadows in the far corner of the room. There, almost obscured by the piles of old sheets and forgotten belongings, something was moving. It was slow, deliberate, like the shifting of something that had been dormant for far too long. Clara. The voice was unmistakable now, a low, almost guttural growl that echoed from the darkness. Her body trembled, her mind screaming for her to turn around, to run back down the stairs, but she couldn't. She was frozen. The air seemed to grow colder with each passing second, the chill creeping down her spine like icy fingers, tightening their grip. The figure emerged from the shadows, its form twisted, distorted, a silhouette that loomed tall and impossibly thin, a hunched shape barely human. Its skin was pale, ashen, stretched tight over its bones. Its eyes, wide and hollow, gleamed with an otherworldly hunger. Clara's pulse quickened as she took a step back, but the figure advanced, its movements unnaturally smooth, like it was gliding over the floor. "Come closer, Clara." The voice was clearer now, right in front of her, emanating from the thing that stood before her. It reached out a long, bony hand, its fingers stretching toward her with terrifying speed. Clara's breath caught in her throat, and before she could move, the figure was upon her, its hand brushing against her arm. The touch was cold, impossibly cold, sending a shock of ice through her veins. It burned, like an eternal frost seeping into her skin, freezing her from the inside out. She cried out, but no sound came from her mouth. She was trapped. The figure's eyes locked onto hers, its gaze piercing through her, as though it was searching her very soul. In that moment, Clara understood. It wasn't just the house that was alive, it was the thing in front of her, the thing that had been waiting, biding its time. It had been here long before Clara, and it wasn't going to let her leave. "You're ours now." The words echoed in her mind, cold and final, and Clara felt her knees give way, her body trembling uncontrollably. But even as the figure loomed over her, something within her stirred. A small spark of defiance, a flicker of hope. She tried to push herself back, her hands bracing against the cold floor, her body shaking with the effort. She had to move. She had to get out of here. But the figure reached for her again, its fingers grazing her neck, and Clara's vision blurred. The room seemed to close in around her, the walls narrowing, the darkness growing deeper, more suffocating. Her breaths became shallow, her heart hammering in her chest as she struggled to stay conscious. And then, in a moment of clarity, something broke through. Her voice fighting against the whispers. No. It was barely a whisper, but it was enough. Enough to break the grip of fear that held her so tightly. The figure faltered for a moment, its hand hovering in the air, and Clara seized the opportunity. With all the strength she could muster, she pushed herself forward, breaking free from the figure's hold. She scrambled to her feet, her legs unsteady, her mind still fogged with terror. But she didn't stop. She ran. The attic door was still open, and she dashed toward it, the coldness of the room chasing her every step, the air thick with the weight of the thing that had been waiting for her. As she reached the doorway, her fingers brushed the frame, and for a brief moment, she thought she was free. But then, the world around her seemed to tilt, spinning wildly, and she felt herself falling, tumbling into darkness. Clara's body hit the ground with a sickening thud, the air knocked from her lungs as her vision swam. For a moment, everything was spinning, a whirl of colors and sounds that made it impossible to focus. She struggled to breathe, her chest tight as though the weight of the house itself was pressing down on her, suffocating her. She tried to push herself up, but her limbs felt like lead, unresponsive, her muscles weak and trembling. The whispers continued, louder now, surrounding her from every direction, as if the house itself was closing in on her. Clara, come back. The voice was distant, yet omnipresent, a low murmur that seemed to seep into her very soul. She gritted her teeth, forcing herself to stand, her hands scraping against the cold, rough wood of the floor for leverage. Her vision was still blurred, but she could make out the dark shadows looming around her, the very walls seeming to breathe and shift with unnatural life. Clara. The voice was close now, almost in her ear, the coldness of it sending a shiver down her spine. She stumbled to her feet, her body unsteady, her heart pounding with fear. There was no way out. She had to get out, but the house, the creature, whatever it was, seemed to be everywhere, its presence closing in. Her thoughts were scattered, desperate. She couldn't remember how she had fallen, how she had gotten here. All she knew was that she had to leave. She turned toward the door, her legs uncooperative, but somehow she managed to take a step forward. The room seemed to twist, the shadows lengthening, reaching toward her with claw-like fingers. The whispers grew louder, more frantic now, overlapping, their voices rising into a deafening chorus. Clara, we need you. It was almost a chant, a rhythmic pulse that seemed to vibrate through her very bones. She felt her pulse quicken, the desperation rising in her chest. There had to be an escape. There had to be a way out. With great effort, Clara forced herself to take another step. And then another. She stumbled toward the door, her vision sharpening, her body screaming in protest. But the door was still open. It seemed so close, but the closer she got, the farther away it felt. Like the house was shifting around her, warping the space, pulling her deeper. The cold was unbearable now, biting through her skin, sinking into her very soul. She could feel it wrapping around her chest, squeezing tighter with every step. Then a sharp sound sliced through the whispers, a sudden, jarring screech that pierced the air like the crack of thunder. Clara froze. Her body seized up, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She turned toward the sound, her heart hammering in her chest. There, standing in the doorway, was the figure, taller than before, its eyes glowing with an unnatural, malevolent light. It was no longer just a silhouette. It was more than just a shadow. It was real. Its skin was stretched thin, its bones jutting out in sharp angles, its face an unholy mask of hunger and despair. Its eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment, Clara thought her heart would stop. Clara. The voice was no longer a whisper, but a command. A dark, authoritative call that echoed in her mind. She was paralyzed. Frozen in place, her body screaming for her to move, but she couldn't. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the figure. It stepped forward, its feet barely making a sound as it moved closer. The air seemed to shift around it, as though the very fabric of the house was bending to its will. Clara's chest tightened as she tried to breathe, the coldness growing even more intense. The figure's hand reached out toward her, its fingers long and gnarled, the skin pale and clammy. Her body trembled in fear, and she could feel her pulse thudding in her ears. "It's time, Clara." The words came again, thick with malice. And just as the figure's fingers brushed her skin, the world around her seemed to explode. A flash of blinding light. A roar. An intense pressure, like 1,000 invisible hands pushing against her, lifting her from the ground. Clara's mind screamed, her body writhing as she was pulled in every direction at once. The light intensified, flooding her senses with a white-hot heat that burned her skin. For a brief moment, everything was silent. The cold, the whispers, the shadows, they all vanished. She was weightless, floating, and then everything stopped. The air was still. The light faded. Clara opened her eyes, but all she saw was darkness. Her heart was racing, her breath shallow, and her body felt numb, disconnected. She couldn't see. She couldn't move. She could barely think. But then, through the darkness, she heard it again. Clara. The voice was softer now, not as sharp, but unmistakable. It was calling her, and this time, she knew it wasn't a whisper. It was a promise. Clara's heart raced in the darkness, her thoughts a blur, as the voice continued to call her name. Clara. It was closer now, its tone not as terrifying, but heavy with something else. Something that felt like a promise, a beckoning, urging her toward the unknown. She wanted to scream, to fight back, but her voice was lost to the emptiness. Her body felt paralyzed, as though she were suspended in a strange limbo, caught between two worlds, one that seemed to want to devour her, and one that was trying to pull her into something even darker. Her breath came faster, more erratic, as she tried to understand where she was, what was happening. "Clara, come closer." It was a whisper now, a soft murmur that slipped into her mind, coaxing her with its insistent pull. She felt it then, the change. The air was no longer cold, but warm, almost suffocating. The temperature around her shifted as though a force was working on the very space she occupied, bending it, stretching it, pulling her deeper into its grasp. The darkness seemed to close in, yet at the same time, it opened up. It felt like she was floating, drifting somewhere between the realms of reality and something else entirely. And then the light returned, dim at first, a faint glow that grew brighter, warmer, until it filled her vision. Clara squinted against the sudden brightness, her eyes adjusting slowly to the light, and when they did, what she saw made her blood run cold. The room around her was no longer the attic. It was a vast, infinite space, filled with swirling mists and shapes that danced at the edges of her vision. A sky that was both dark and full of light, shifting in colors that couldn't exist in the waking world. The whispers were louder now, but no longer just voices. It was as if the space itself was speaking to her, urging her forward, guiding her steps. Clara. She stumbled forward, her legs feeling heavy, her body no longer obeying her every command. The warmth around her was thick, oppressive, and the air hummed with the energy of something ancient and unfathomable. The floor beneath her feet shifted like liquid, giving way with each step she took. The ground seemed alive, pulsating, as if it was breathing beneath her. She tried to stop herself, tried to turn back, but she couldn't. There was no going back. Ahead of her, a silhouette emerged from the shifting mists, a figure just like the one she had seen in the attic. Tall, dark, and filled with an overwhelming presence. It was standing still, waiting for her, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light that seemed to pierce the very depths of her soul. Clara stopped in her tracks, her body frozen with fear. She wanted to scream, to run, but the figure, whatever it was, had its eyes fixed on her, and she felt an uncontrollable urge to step closer. The closer she got, the more the air seemed to hum, vibrating with an energy that felt too powerful, too consuming. The figure's mouth opened, and this time, there was no whisper, only words that were spoken with an undeniable finality. "You belong here, Clara." Her chest tightened, the words pressing into her like a weight she could not escape. She felt her mind begin to unravel, as though the world around her was collapsing into chaos, but at the same time, there was something else, something familiar, a fleeting sense of comfort, of knowing that this was somehow her place. Her heartbeat slowed, her breathing deepened, and she felt herself being drawn closer still, as if she were walking toward her fate, toward something she had always known was waiting for her. She reached out, her hand trembling, as if to touch the figure, to feel what was pulling her in. But just as her fingers brushed the cold air before it, a shock of cold surged through her, sending her back. The figure's eyes burned with a new intensity, and a voice, deep, commanding, resonating with ancient power, reached her ears. "It's too late to escape." The words felt like chains wrapping around her, anchoring her to the very core of this strange realm. Clara's breath caught in her throat, her chest aching as the weight of the figure's gaze pressed down upon her. And then, with a sudden, jarring force, the world around her shifted again. The mists cleared, and the glowing light dimmed, revealing something else, something terrible. The figure stretched toward her, its arms impossibly long, its fingers curling as though they were beckoning her to come closer, to embrace her fate. But Clara refused. With every ounce of willpower she had left, she stepped back, stumbling through the shifting, breathing ground beneath her. The figure's form twisted and warped, as though the very space around it was folding in on itself. Clara felt the presence pulling away from her, the suffocating pressure loosening, but the darkness still lingered, heavy in the air. Her feet hit solid ground again, the world stabilizing around her. And as she dared to look up, she saw something else, something that hadn't been there before. In the distance, a single light flickered. It was the light of the house she had left behind, the house that was calling her. The darkness that had consumed her seemed to retreat, and for the first time, Clara felt a sense of clarity. The house wasn't just a place, it was a living, breathing thing, a force that had been guiding her all along. And she knew now, with chilling certainty, that the journey was far from over. Clara's breath came in shallow gasps as the light in the distance flickered once more, drawing her eyes like a beacon in the consuming dark. The house. It was calling to her, a soundless whisper that seemed to vibrate through the very air. The ground beneath her feet still shifted, the strange, breathing sensation growing stronger with each passing second. It was as if the land itself, this otherworldly space, was alive, wrapping around her with an urgency she couldn't fully understand. The house is waiting for you. The words filled her mind, echoing through her like a drumbeat that reverberated in her bones. The voice, though no longer the same as the figures, was unmistakable, a voice that carried with it the weight of something ancient, something that had seen the rise and fall of forgotten worlds. Clara's body moved of its own accord, drawn toward the light as if it were a magnet, each step an automatic pull. Her muscles screamed with exhaustion, her limbs begging for rest, but the force that surrounded her was too strong. The mist swirled around her as she moved, and the air grew thick again, turning heavier with each breath she took. The figure was gone, lost in the shifting shadows of the place, but its presence lingered. It was still there, somewhere in the periphery of her vision, watching her, waiting. But Clara didn't look back. She couldn't afford to. Her feet took her across the vast expanse, the ground shifting underfoot like liquid, until the light ahead grew brighter, clearer. It wasn't long before the faint glow became solid, a sharp contrast against the surrounding darkness. And in the center of the light, she saw it. The house, but it wasn't the same house she had known. It was grander, more imposing, its walls shimmering with an ethereal glow that seemed to pulse with life. The windows reflected her presence, but there was something unnatural about them, as if they held memories of a time long past. The door stood ajar, waiting for her. The moment Clara crossed the threshold, she felt the air change again, warmer, richer, but charged with a strange energy that hummed at the back of her mind. The house was alive, not in the way people were, but in a way that felt ancient, as though it had a soul of its own, one that had watched the world change for centuries. The walls seemed to breathe with her, pulsing with every step she took. And in the heart of the house, in the vast, dimly lit hallway ahead of her, Clara felt the presence of something watching. She wasn't alone. The air was heavy with a lingering force, something that had been there long before her arrival. Something that had been waiting for her. As she moved through the hallway, the faint sound of a door creaking open behind her made her freeze. Slowly, Clara turned, her heart racing. The figure was there again, no longer hidden in the shadows, but standing at the end of the hall, watching her with those dark, piercing eyes. It was as though it had been expecting her. Clara's pulse quickened. Her mind screamed for her to run, to leave, but the house was different now. She felt its pull, like a part of her had always belonged here, waiting for this moment to come. The figure moved toward her, its movement smooth and unhurried, as though it knew she couldn't escape, as though it knew she would never escape. "You're home, Clara." The words echoed through her mind like a chant, a mantra that forced itself into her thoughts, seizing control of her every rational thought. The figure was almost upon her now, its presence enveloping her like a fog, the air thick with the power that radiated from it. And then, as it reached out to her with those long, skeletal fingers, the air around Clara trembled, and the world seemed to shift again. Everything spun, the light from the house flickering and distorting as if the very fabric of reality was tearing at the seams. She couldn't breathe, couldn't move, couldn't think. The overwhelming pressure of the house's presence crushed her. And then, just as everything seemed to collapse around her, there was a sudden clarity, a sharp, piercing realization. The house wasn't just a place. It wasn't just a structure made of wood and stone. It was a part of her history, her family, her bloodline. It was the thing that had always guided her, always watched over her. The thing that had waited, patiently, for her return. Clara. The voice was gentler now, softer, filled with an undeniable warmth. The figure's presence still lingered, but now it was no longer a threat. It was something else. Something she couldn't quite understand, but felt deep within herself. She felt it in her bones. This was where she was meant to be. And as the last of her fear faded away, Clara stepped forward, toward the figure, toward the heart of the house, where it had all begun. The walls whispered as she moved, the air growing warmer, as though the house itself was welcoming her back. And Clara, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, felt at peace. The darkness was no longer frightening, and the weight of the house no longer oppressive. It was home. The house had waited for her. And now it was complete. The house and Clara were one. Clara stood still, her body bathed in the dim, golden light that now filled the house, the warmth of it sinking deep into her skin. The air hummed with life, a quiet, comforting pulse that seemed to sync with her heartbeat. Her mind, once a whirl of confusion and terror, was now eerily still. She could feel the presence of the house, no longer oppressive, but protective, like an old friend whose embrace had always been there, waiting for her to return. The walls seemed to recognize her, their energy aligning with her own as though they were part of her essence, intertwined over generations. The figure was still before her, standing tall, its sharp features softened in the ambient glow. Its eyes were no longer filled with malice, but with something she could only describe as understanding. It was not her enemy. It was a guardian, a keeper of this place, and it had been waiting for her. Clara. The voice came again, gentler, resonating not only in her mind, but in her chest, like a song from deep within the earth, as if it had always been a part of her. The figure's presence no longer felt like a threat. Instead, it felt like a doorway to something far greater, something ancient and untouchable. It was not just watching her, it was guiding her, leading her deeper into the heart of the house. The floor beneath her feet shifted slightly, and she realized, without a single word spoken, that it was time. The house was calling her, urging her forward, not as a captive, but as its heir. This was her place, her legacy, and she had been blind to it for so long. But now everything was clear. Clara took a slow, deliberate step toward the figure, her feet moving almost of their own accord. As she did, the walls seemed to breathe with her, each step echoing softly in the stillness. The house was alive, alive with the memory of those who had come before her, and now she was part of it. A new chapter, a new keeper, ready to carry forward the legacy that had been waiting for her to discover. With each step, the figure's presence grew stronger, more defined. Clara felt herself drawn into it, as if her very being was merging with the soul of the house itself. The shadows in the corners of the room flickered, retreating as if making way for her. Finally, she stood before the figure, her heart steady, her mind clear. It reached out toward her, its long, gnarled hand hovering above her own. She felt a pulse, a warmth radiating from its fingers, and without hesitation, she extended her hand to meet it. As their hands touched, a surge of energy flowed through Clara, filling her from the tips of her fingers to the core of her being. She gasped, the power overwhelming, yet comforting, as if the house, the land, and the air itself were alive within her. She could feel the weight of generations before her, the knowledge, the stories, the memories. It was all there, passing into her like a flood of ancient wisdom. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Clara's thoughts blurred, her mind expanding, as if she were connecting with something beyond herself. The house, the figure, the world, it was all part of her, and she was part of it. Then, as quickly as it had come, the sensation faded. Clara took a deep breath, and when she opened her eyes, the world seemed brighter, clearer, more vivid. She felt whole, complete in a way she had never known before. The weight of her past was no longer a burden, it was a gift, a legacy she was now bound to carry forward. The figure stepped back, nodding once as though its task was complete. Its eyes no longer glowed with malice, but with a soft, knowing light. It had led her here. It had given her the power, the strength to understand her place. The house, once dark and foreboding, now seemed to pulse with life, its energy intertwined with hers. The walls, the floors, the very air, all of it was her responsibility now. It was her legacy, and the house had chosen her to carry it into the future. Clara stood tall, no longer afraid, no longer uncertain. She was the keeper of the house now, and the house, with all its mysteries and secrets, was hers. As she turned away from the figure, she felt a calm satisfaction settle deep within her. The whispers had stopped. The shadows had retreated. Everything was as it should be. And for the first time in her life, Clara felt at peace. The house was no longer a place of fear. It was a sanctuary, a refuge for those who would come after her. And she would protect it, honor it, as it had always protected her. It was her home. It was her destiny. And as the figure vanished into the mist, Clara knew she was no longer alone. She was finally where she belonged. The air in the house had shifted again. It was no longer heavy with anticipation or the weight of a centuries-old legacy. It was light, alive, with a quiet energy that whispered through the walls as though the house itself was breathing, in harmony with Clara's own breath. The light filtering through the windows had changed too, softening, casting long shadows that stretched across the ancient floors. The sound of the wind outside had died down, leaving behind only the faint murmur of the house's pulse. It was as if the world had finally exhaled, waiting for Clara to move forward. With her heart still steady, Clara walked deeper into the house, her footsteps sure and confident now. Each room she passed felt different. They no longer felt like abandoned spaces filled with forgotten memories. Instead, they seemed to hum with a quiet, subtle power, a power that connected her to every inch of the house, every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of the candles. It was as if the house had always known she would come home, and it had been patiently waiting, preparing itself for her return. She reached the grand staircase that spiraled upward, the polished banister gleaming softly in the dim light. The stairs had once seemed daunting, an obstacle to be avoided, but now they felt like the natural next step, a progression, a path leading her further into her new role. As Clara ascended, the house seemed to wrap itself around her in an embrace. The very walls seemed to hum in recognition, a low sound that resonated deep within her bones, almost like a song from long ago. Her senses were heightened now, each breath drawing in the scent of old wood and lavender. She could feel the presence of those who had lived here before, their spirits woven into the fabric of the house, guiding her every step. At the top of the stairs, the long hallway stretched out before her, filled with doors that led into rooms she had never entered. The possibilities felt endless, but there was no fear now, no doubt. She knew exactly where she needed to go. She had always known. Clara walked to the end of the hallway, her hands brushing lightly against the walls as she passed. Each touch felt like a conversation, a silent exchange of energy between her and the house. The door at the end of the hallway stood slightly ajar, just as it had in her dream. Her pulse quickened as she approached, but it was not fear she felt now, it was something else, something more profound. Hope. She reached out and pushed the door open. The room beyond was not like the others. It was larger, more expansive, its windows looking out over the sprawling grounds of the estate. The light in this room was different, brighter, yet soft, almost like it had been filtered through a veil of mist. The furniture was sparse, but elegant. A large, antique desk sat in the center, papers scattered across it, as though someone had been in the midst of working, but had been called away. Clara stepped inside, her eyes scanning the room. Everything felt familiar, as if she had been here before, but in another time, another life. At the far wall of the room, there was a painting, an old, faded portrait. The subject was a woman, her features soft but strong, her eyes gazing directly at Clara with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. The woman in the painting was her. Clara's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the portrait. The woman's face was almost identical to hers, though the eyes were older, wiser, eyes that held centuries of knowledge and experience. Clara could see it now, the subtle resemblance that had always been there, hidden beneath the surface. The woman in the painting smiled, a faint, knowing smile, and Clara suddenly understood. This woman had been her ancestor, her mother, her grandmother, a great-grandmother, someone who had lived in this house long before her. And like Clara, she had been called here to protect it. A surge of emotion flooded Clara's chest as the realization settled over her. She was not alone. She had never been alone. The house, the legacy, the power, it had all been waiting for her, just as it had waited for those who came before her. The door behind Clara creaked softly as it closed, and she turned to see the figure standing in the doorway again. This time, there was no fear, no hesitation. The figure nodded, as though affirming her understanding. "It is your time now, Clara." The voice was not threatening, not commanding. It was gentle, reassuring, like a father guiding his daughter. Clara felt the weight of its meaning, the responsibility that came with being the keeper of this place, this legacy. But for the first time, she didn't feel overwhelmed. She felt ready. The figure faded into the shadows of the hallway, leaving Clara alone in the room with the portrait. But she wasn't truly alone. Not anymore. The house, her ancestors, the very land itself were all with her now. They had always been with her, waiting for her to step into her rightful place. Clara turned back to the desk, her eyes scanning the paper scattered across its surface. They were filled with old notes, records, and plans, things her ancestors had written down, things that had been passed down through generations. A map of the estate, lists of names, rituals, and secrets, all leading to one simple truth. This house, this place, was her home, and she was the one who would protect it. With a steady hand, Clara picked up the quill from the desk, dipped it in ink, and began to write. Her legacy had just begun. Clara's hand moved with purpose, the ink flowing across the paper as if guided by something beyond her. The words she wrote were not her own, but something deeper, something that connected her to the very heart of the house. It was as if the house itself was speaking through her, urging her to preserve its secrets, to carry on the work that had been passed down through the generations. Her writing became steady, rhythmic, as if she were reciting an ancient prayer. The room seemed to grow warmer, the light softening around her as though the very walls of the house were listening, absorbing every word. The energy in the air had changed again, no longer heavy or tense, but calm, like the stillness after a storm. Clara could feel the weight of her ancestors' eyes upon her, their presence surrounding her, offering silent encouragement. She had never felt more connected to them, more a part of this house, this legacy. The moment she had feared, when she would finally have to accept her place, had come, and instead of dread, there was peace. Each line she wrote seemed to unlock something new, some forgotten piece of knowledge that had been hidden for centuries. It wasn't just about the house anymore. It was about the people who had lived here, the history that had shaped this place, and the role Clara was destined to play in it. She wasn't just the keeper of the house. She was its future, its protector, its continuation. The quill lifted from the paper, and Clara sat back, looking at the words she had written. It was a contract of sorts, but not one that had been dictated to her. It was something she had chosen, something she had claimed. She was the keeper now, the guardian of the house's secrets, its stories, its memories. The room around her seemed to breathe in time with her thoughts, the walls gently pulsing, the light flickering as if in approval. Clara felt a quiet pride welling up inside her, a deep sense of belonging she had never known before. This was her home, and she would protect it, nurture it, as it had once nurtured her. As she rose from the desk, the portrait on the wall seemed to watch her with renewed understanding. The woman in the painting smiled again, a soft, approving smile. Clara could almost feel her presence, as if the portrait were more than just an image. It was a doorway, a bridge between the past and the future. The door to the room opened slowly, the hinges creaking as if an invitation. Clara walked toward it, her step steady and sure. The air around her felt lighter now, the tension that had once gripped the house fading into the background. She was no longer an outsider. She was home. Down the hallway, the figure that had guided her before was waiting once again, its dark eyes filled with quiet strength. It stood still, a silent sentinel at the threshold of the room. Clara paused for a moment, meeting its gaze, and then nodded, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. The figure stepped aside, allowing her to pass. She walked into the next room, the familiar walls now feeling like an old friend's embrace. The house had not just accepted her, it had welcomed her back. It had prepared her, just as it had prepared those before her. Clara moved deeper into the heart of the house, her senses alive with every breath. The floor beneath her feet, the air in the room, the soft rustle of curtains as the wind stirred them. They were all a part of her now. She could feel the energy flowing through the walls, a current that had always been there, waiting for her to tap into it. She had only just begun to understand the magnitude of what it meant to be the keeper. She wasn't just guarding the house. She was protecting the very fabric of time, of history, of all that had come before her. The stories, the memories, the lessons, they all lived within the house, and now they lived within her. She moved from room to room, her touch lingering on the walls, the furniture, as though greeting old friends. With each step, Clara felt a deeper sense of connection to the house, to the land, to the legacy she had inherited. It was not just a place. It was a living, breathing entity, and it had chosen her to be its protector. In the distance, she could hear the faint sound of birds singing outside, the soft rustle of the trees as the wind moved through them. The sun had begun to rise, casting a soft glow across the landscape. It was a new day, a new beginning, and Clara, standing at the heart of the house, knew she was ready. The house had waited for her, and now she would wait for those who came after her. The legacy would continue, and the house, with all its secrets and wisdom, would remain safe, protected, forever. The light of the morning flooded through the windows, bright and clear, as Clara stood at the threshold of her new life. And as she looked out over the land, she knew that this was only the beginning. Clara stood still, gazing out the window, her reflection mingling with the soft light of the morning. The land before her was bathed in the golden hues of dawn, the trees casting long shadows across the earth, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. The world seemed to be holding its breath, as though waiting for something that Clara was about to bring. The house behind her hummed with quiet energy, its walls alive with the vibrations of her new purpose. She could feel it, the connection between her and the house deepening with each passing second. She was no longer a visitor here. She was part of its pulse, its rhythm. It was then that she realized how much she had changed. The woman who had walked into this house days ago, uncertain, frightened, and disconnected, was no longer the same. She had become something more. She had become the keeper of the house's legacy, its protector, its heart. Clara turned away from the window and looked back down the hallway, her steps measured and deliberate. There was still much to do. The house had revealed its secrets to her, but it had also entrusted her with responsibilities. She could feel the weight of them, but it no longer felt like a burden. It felt like a calling. She made her way to the grand staircase again, her feet moving with confidence, the once daunting steps now an easy climb. The air around her seemed to grow thicker as she ascended, charged with anticipation, as if the house itself was excited for what was to come. At the top of the stairs, she paused, her gaze sweeping over the hallway ahead. The rooms, the doors, everything in the house was now within her reach, within her care. The whispers of the past were still present, but they no longer held the same fear. They were stories now, waiting to be shared, lessons to be passed down, just as the house had shared its secrets with her. Her hand brushed against the wall, and she felt the faintest ripple of energy course through her fingers. She smiled softly. The house was with her always. The legacy of the past, the memories of those who had come before her. They would guide her, but they would not define her. She would make her own mark, just as they had before her. In the distance, she heard the sound of footsteps, soft and deliberate, like someone moving through the house with purpose. Clara turned, her heart skipping a beat, but when she saw the figure standing in the doorway of the room behind her, she felt no fear, no uncertainty. It was the same figure, the one that had guided her, the one that had been there since the beginning. But now there was a new energy surrounding it. It no longer felt like an apparition, a shadow from the past. It felt like an ally, a companion. The figure stepped forward, its eyes meeting hers with an understanding that transcended words. "You are ready," the voice echoed in her mind, calm and assured. Clara nodded, her chest swelling with pride and purpose. She had known it in her heart all along, but hearing it now, feeling the weight of the figure's approval, solidified it. She was ready. The house was hers to protect, to guide, to nurture. The figure moved toward her, and Clara followed, walking side by side through the halls that were now hers to govern. The doors they passed were not just rooms, they were chapters in the ongoing story of the house, waiting to be opened, explored, and understood. With each step, Clara felt the connection between her and the house growing stronger, like the intertwining of roots in the earth. They reached the door that led to the heart of the house, the room Clara had discovered only days before. The room where the house's history had been laid bare, where the legacy had been passed down. She reached for the doorknob, her hand steady and sure, and pushed it open. Inside, the space had not changed. It still held the same quiet power, the same ancient energy that had filled her with awe and reverence. But now, as she stepped inside, Clara felt something different. She felt like she belonged here, like she was not just a part of the house's history, but a part of its future. The figure stood at the threshold, watching her, as if waiting for her to take the next step. Clara turned back to look at it one last time, and in its eyes, she saw something more than approval. She saw trust. Trust that she would carry the house's legacy forward. Trust that she would honor the past while creating something new. Clara smiled, her heart full. She stepped deeper into the room, the weight of the past and the promise of the future resting on her shoulders. The house was hers now, and she was ready. She had always been ready. Clara stood still, feeling the weight of the room settle around her. The air was thick with anticipation, as if the house itself was holding its breath, watching her every move. She had stepped into the heart of it, a place that had once seemed like a mystery, a place filled with secrets and whispers of the past. Now, it felt like her own, a part of her, as much a reflection of who she was as it was a reminder of who had come before her. She could hear the faint echo of footsteps behind her, the figure still standing at the threshold, its presence grounding her, reminding her that she was not alone in this. The quiet strength in the figure's gaze was all the reassurance she needed. Clara was no longer uncertain of her role here. She knew who she was, what she was meant to do. The house had chosen her, and she had accepted that choice, not out of obligation, but out of love for this place, for the legacy it carried. The walls that had once seemed so imposing, the silence that had once been so unnerving, now felt like an embrace. She was a part of something greater, something ancient and timeless. Her eyes scanned the room, the familiar objects and artifacts, each one now holding a new significance. The memories of those who had lived here before her were alive within these walls, waiting to be uncovered. Clara could feel their presence in the air, the traces of their lives woven into the very fabric of the house. She would honor them. She would carry their stories forward. The figure stepped forward, its movements slow but deliberate. Clara turned to face it, and for the first time, she saw it not as a guide, but as a companion. It was no longer a shadow of the past, but a part of her future. Together, they would protect this place, keep it safe for the generations that would come after. With a deep breath, Clara nodded to the figure, a silent promise between them. She had embraced her destiny. She was the keeper of the house now, its protector, its heart. And as she stepped further into the room, the weight of the past and the hope for the future blended into one. The house, her home, was no longer a mystery. It was a place of peace. And Clara knew that it would remain so, as long as she stood watch. The sun had fully risen now, its light spilling across the house in soft, golden beams that seemed to weave through the windows and stretch across the rooms like fingers reaching for something long lost but now found. Clara stood by the window in the heart of the house, her eyes gazing out over the land she had come to know so well. The once unfamiliar hills, the sprawling gardens, the ancient trees, they were all part of her now. They were not just the landscape, they were her family, her responsibility. The figure had faded into the shadows, once more, leaving Clara to her own thoughts. She felt no fear, no uncertainty. Instead, there was a calmness, a certainty in her chest. The house had become her anchor, and in turn, she had become its guardian. She knew the paths that lay ahead were not always easy, but she also knew she was not alone. Behind her, the house whispered. The walls groaned softly as if stretching, waking up from a long slumber. The house had been waiting, and now that Clara had stepped into her role, it could breathe again. It could grow, evolve, continue its legacy through her. Clara could feel the pulse of it, deep beneath her feet, in the very foundation of the place. It was alive, and it was hers to protect. She walked through the house one last time that morning, her fingers brushing the familiar textures of the walls, the soft grain of the wood, the cool stone. The rooms, each one, now felt like old friends, old stories that had been told and retold, waiting for the next chapter. She moved through the hallway and toward the door that had once seemed like the boundary between the past and the future. Now it felt like a doorway to a new beginning. She pushed it open and stepped outside, the air fresh with the scent of morning dew, the promise of new life. The house stood behind her, its silhouette strong against the rising sun. And as Clara gazed out across the land, she knew with every fiber of her being that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The house was safe, the legacy secure, and the future, hers to shape. And with that, Clara took a deep breath, her heart at peace, knowing that the story of the house, of her ancestors, and of herself would continue, forever intertwined in the threads of time.